Now, if you're on the previous DVD and you've listened to the mix at the end of that volume, and you've taken the time out to listen to the mix in that last session there, you've probably come to realise just how small the changes we've made there are, if you could even hear them at all. Now, if you don't on the previous volume, well, you'll just have to trust me when I say that the changes are incredibly small. In fact, you're probably wondering why I'm bothering to mention this at all. After all, this DVD is about mixing and not about the arrangement and production of trance. But that would be missing the point I'm trying to make here entirely. Music isn't just about mixing, it's about the culmination of sounds, the arrangement and the mixing, and it's attention to detail that separates a good mix from a great one. So if you feel the need to add the odd effect here or the small amount of automation there just to make it that little bit better, then do it before you start mixing. Try and make it sound the very best it can before you jump into the mix. Now, for this session, what we're going to do is we're going to start to look at how generally you can set up a mixer for mixing trance. Now, before we start, I should mention that all engineers like to set up their mixers in specific ways before they start mixing any track, and you will find that every engineer not only sets their mixer up differently than every other engineer, but they also set the mixers up differently depending on the genre of music that they're going to be mixing. For example, I'll set up a mixer entirely differently if I'm going to mix down a house track than I would if I'm mixing a trance track. And how the mixer is set up depends on the generally accepted sound of the mix. So in order to set a desk up for mixing music, what we first need to do is think about our approach to the music and how we want the mix to sound. Now, when I'm talking about the sound of a mix, I don't mean how the instruments sound. What I'm referring to is the sound of the mix as a whole. Music is about getting a message across to the listeners, and the mixing plays an integral part of getting that message across to those listeners. If the music could be considered a gift, the mix is the gift box that you would deliver it in. And just the same as you wouldn't give someone a Christmas present wrapped in a newspaper, you shouldn't give listeners a mix wrapped in crap either. So when you come to approaching a mix, you first need to listen to the message of the music, and then you can use the mix to enhance that message and really get it across. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're working in a studio, you sat there twiddling your thumbs because there's nothing in at the moment, and all of a sudden you get a call from a record company asking you to mix a record for their latest artist. They'll be dropping the multi-tracks in with you in about an hour and need it back within a couple of hours. And actually, believe me, that isn't an uncommon occurrence, that. Rather than twiddle your thumbs for an hour or so waiting for the track to be delivered, what you need to do is you need to set up the desk so as soon as the masters arrive, you can start on the mix. Now, there's no such thing as a generic mix setup, and you don't want to waste channels. So the first thing you ask is the name of the band and the name of the track, because both of these are going to give you a pretty good idea of the sound of the mix. So as an example, let's say the band's called Blood and Death, and the track is called Riding My Chainsaw. Now, as painful as that sounds, from the name of the band and the record, I'd surmise there that it's going to be a heavy metal track. So it's going to involve electric guitars, most probably screaming vocals, and it's going to have a real drum kit in it. I certainly wouldn't imagine with a band name like that and a song title of Riding My Chainsaw to be a love song. So you know it's about chainsaws, and you know that you need to help to put that message across to the listeners. Now, to get that message across, would you plan to apply soft reverb to the guitars, chorus them until they're nice and soft and sit in the background, reverb down the drums so they thud softly, and then apply a chorus and harmonise the lead vocals so they sound sweet? Or would you make the drum kick hard as nails, add distortion to the guitar so they bite through the mix, and also add some small amounts of controlled distortion to the lead so he's screaming through the mix too? Well, if you've got any sense about it, you'd take the second approach. You consider effects and an overall general approach that would help you put that message across. So I'd set up the desk probably with a few send channels of distortion, compression, trash, and valves and other effects like that could give the feeling. And also, whilst I was waiting, I tend to listen to some heavy metal to get myself in the mood, to get in the feeling of heavy metal ready for the masters to arrive. Now, by that I don't mean I'm going to be copying somebody else's mix. what I'm doing is I'm listening to the mixes to try and get in the right frame of mind for the mix. Of course, you may not make the kick as hard as nails or apply distortion to the guitars, but I'm sure you'd make that effort to maintain its feel. Singing about riding a chainsaw would require a totally different approach to some X Factor winner warbling on about how beautiful a pet dog is or how she wants to fight for your love or something like that. Now, if you have watched the previous DVD, you'll have noticed there that I kept banging on about feel. I kept asking, can you feel it? When the rhythm was programmed, can you feel the rhythm? When we put the bass in there, can you feel the rhythm even more? Can you feel the groove of the record? Can you feel the track? Of course, we're all going to feel music differently, but not only must we be able to hear the message to be able to get it through, we also need to be able to feel it in some way to be able to do a mix some justice. Now, this is an incredibly important aspect of mixing and something that I just can't stress enough. Mixing is often seen as incredibly difficult, but it isn't really that hard. And generally, the reason it's viewed as difficult is because the engineer tends to be blinded by technology and with the solid goal of producing this clear, crystal mix. So much so that they tend to ignore the message and the feel of the music and end up removing all emotion from the record. And the fact is that any monkey can make a professional technical mix, a mix that sounds as though it was mixed by a computer. Technically accurate, all the instruments can be heard, but the problem with it is it lacks any emotion whatsoever, and that's where the mix falls down. That's the type of mix that turns listeners off, and just as you injected your soul into the making of the track, you have to do exactly the same when it comes to mixing a track. I mean, obviously, whereas I may apply reverb to a certain instrument or soften it with EQ, you may take the opposite approach and make it harsher with EQ. But whatever you do, you have to maintain your creativity and let your soul come through that mix, just as you did with the music. So the first thing you need to do is listen to the mix and get a feel for it. What message is it trying to put across? What feeling is it trying to convey? How does it make you feel? How could you improve on it? Now, I listened to the track on playback in the previous session and I've achieved the feel for it that I want for this mix. Now, if you didn't, why not? I mean, come on, you want to mix this music, you've just listened to the track that we're going to mix now and you try to tell me you've listened to it without even bothering to get some sort of feel for the music. If you haven't got a feel for the music, jump back to the next session, listen to it again and try and get a feel for this music, because this is the fundamental key of mixing. You must have the feel for the music. You must be able to accentuate what you like about that record. Now, listening back to it, there were 3 to 4 ways I could mix that track and totally change its message. I could put a huge amount of emphasis on just the bass and the drums, leaving the lead section as just an incidental sound occurring in the background. I could apply heavy distortion to the bass and to the kick to really bring it out. I could make kind of a heavy trance track out of what is essentially a trance track. Alternatively, I could put a lot of emphasis on the leads, absolutely smother them in reverb and chorus to really bring them out to the top of the mix and push pretty much the rest of the instrumentation into the background, making a more euphoric trance track. Or instead I could put a huge emphasis on the pads, smother them in effects to really bring them out. And if I did that, I'd EQ down the kick, put reverb onto it and create more of a chilled out mix. I could even settle down the leads a little, apply echo, EQ them down, use filters, and I could use that to create a progressive feel to the track. Now, just from saying that, I hope you've now got the idea of how you can mix differently depending on the message you think you should give across to your listeners, or the message you feel you want to inject into it. And this is the reason why if you send your mix off to another engineer, it can come back sounding surprisingly different. Now, as I said, I've got an idea of how I want this track to sound, and I've no doubt it will probably be very different from what you feel and what you feel the message is. As I've mentioned, mixing is a creative endeavour, so each engineer will work in a method they like. Therefore, I need to stress that what I do shouldn't necessarily be what you should do. Feel free to try out what I do, but more importantly, twist and warp it to suit you. It's your own mind, your own feelings, and you've listened to this record, you've got your own feel for it, and you need to do what you feel is right for it. Now, before I continue on with this, one thing I do need to point out is that I generally do mix on a hardware desk. But in order to make this a bit more accessible to everyone who's going to watch this DVD, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stay within the box and mix within the computer. And to do that, I'm going to have a little help from the SSL Duendi. Now, for those who haven't heard of a Duendi, it's essentially an SSL mixing desk in an external unit. You connect it to the computer via FireWire, and basically all it does is give you a software EQ interface to mix on, while the external unit does all the magic. So what we'll do is we'll call up an SSL here, and I'll just give you a quick walkthrough of the EQ system. As you can see there, it's pretty simple in its layout. You've got your high pass and low pass filters there, your low frequency, your low mids, your high mids, and your high frequency. An input section, the compressor, a gate expander section, and basically the output, and that's it. But as simple as that really looks, I have to say that after listening to it for about a week or so now, it's absolutely beautiful. I'm not sure they've managed it. I know that some on the internet are saying they actually took DSPs from the hardware desks and put them into an external box, but whether that's true or not, I don't know. But one thing I will say is it sounds just like an SSL. Now, if you haven't heard of SSL or their desks, I can guarantee that you'll have heard one. I think it's pretty safe to say that over 80% of all commercial mixes are performed on an SSL desk, and with bloody good reason. They really do sound fantastic. Now, it really is. This is a professional EQ filter system, and in my opinion, the best mix alternative available if you're going to mix inside your box. I have heard of the Liquid Mix. I've had a good play with it and had a listen, and well, a little too resonant and a little bit too flat for my liking. So if I have to recommend one personally, it's going to be the SSL along with the SSL bus compressor. So basically that's what we're mixing with for this tutorial. Now, I can already hear some moaning that I should be mixing just on a computer and not relying on anything external whatsoever. But like in the previous DVD, the whole purpose and goal of these two DVDs is to produce a commercial mix ready for public release. And quite simply, you can't accomplish a professional sounding commercial mix using a bunch of free EQs that you downloaded off the web the other week, or even the ones that came bundled with your sequencer. Yes, Logic EQs do sound okay, as do Nuendos, Cubase, Sonar and so forth, but they're not a patch on the SSL, and I'm not going to lie to you and start playing around with the free EQs we get and say, oh, this is how you do a commercial mix, when it isn't. You got to remember that this is your music, and it's only going to sound as good as the gear you put it through. Now, is it really worth working so hard to produce a great track, a great arrangement, to then screw it up by putting it through a crappy EQ? I suppose in one way it's like making a bass-heavy record and trying to play it through a mono transistor radio. You're wasting your time. If you're going to do it, spend the money and do it properly. Now, whilst we're on the subject of EQs, there is something else I need to point out, and that's, unless you have an EQ system like this, I always recommend cutting rather than boosting. Whilst you can get away with boosting on an SSL desk, you're not going to be as lucky on pretty much anything else. It tends to add an unpleasant distortion and resonance, and that can quickly clutter a mix and make it sound awful. Therefore, what I'm going to say is, if you're following along with me doing this and you don't own a Duendi, when I boost a frequency, use your EQ to make cuts either side of that frequency, which will pretty much give you the same effect as boosting that frequency. Now, if you're unsure what I mean there, the best thing I can recommend is reread the mixing chapter in the Dance Music Manual, which, off the top of my head, I think it's chapter 21 or 20, so somewhere around there, because this isn't a course for beginners. I'm expecting you to know what EQ is and how to use it. Anyway, what we'll do is we'll set this desk up to start some mixing, so I'll just take that off again because we don't want that on yet to confuse things. Now, for this mix, the message and feel I have in mind is quite subtle with no real aggression to it. So for me, what I'm going to need there is reverb, chorus and compression. If I was going to make the track a little more aggressive, I'd probably replace some of the reverbs with distortion and so on and so forth. So what I'll do first, I'm going to create 6 aux bus channels. Now, I've mentioned this many times before. This isn't intended as a how to use a specific sequencer. So whether you're using Cubase or whatever, just add your channels in. I'm to be using Logic here, and it's unimportant. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw 4 reverbs onto these first 4 aux channels here. So what we'll do is we'll call it the Space Designer. I'll throw one there. Just close it. Close them down again. Now, the first thing I should mention is the quality of your reverb is going to be essential. Just as you have to use a great EQ, you have to use a great reverb unit too. And anything less, your mix is going to fall apart around your ears. And so yes, again, it does mean spending a little more money. But if you want your music to sound good, it doesn't come cheap. Now, obviously, I'm using Logic's own Space Designers there. They're not the best sounding reverb in the world, and I'm not going to lie to you and say that they are. In other words, they're not lexicons, and when I'm mixing on a hardware desk, I will use lexicons, but to be honest, the Space Design is a fairly decent reverb, and I've no doubt it'll work okay for this mix. If you're using Cubase or Sonar, I'm sure you'll have a decent reverb that you can use, and always try and use the best reverb you have. Now, I use these reverbs generally to position a sound towards the front or rear of the mix. The more I send the timbre to the reverb, the further back in the mix I'll end up pushing it. But I also tend to use them for thickening timbres as well, especially the lead timbre. To accomplish this, what I tend to do is I don't use any pre-delay. Now, if you've read the manual, you know that by using a pre-delay, you can set the impression of a room. Higher settings make for a larger space, but if the pre-delay is set to 0, you can often use it to thicken a timbre rather than throw it too far back in a mix. And it should also go without saying, really, if you've read the manual, but you should never depend entirely on one reverb setting for any mix, and always use a number of them to produce a sense of space within the mix. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start to call up a few presets on these reverbs. So what we'll do is we'll call up this first one. Now I'm going to start with a relatively small space, then 2 mediums, then another small with some pre-delay. I won't necessarily use all these reverbs, and as the mix progresses, I may end up removing some, I may end up adding some more, or even adjusting the settings. It all depends on how the mix goes. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a small space. Now, I don't want anything too large here. Around 0.7 seconds would be fine, really. What we'll do is we'll go for a realistic room there. What we'll do, we can use that setting there to add some general ambience to parts. We'll just take that pre-delay up just about 5 milliseconds there. And what we'll do is we'll call up the second reverb here. Now for this one, we're going to go for a medium space. We're going to double our 0.7 and go for about 1.5, I'd say. It's a piano warm. It's quite a warm sounding preset. It's got quite a warm sound to it. And what we'll do there is we can use this one. If we leave this on 0 there, we could use this to thicken timbres. But if we increase that there, just say 5 milliseconds again, we can then use that to throw sounds right to the back of the mix and create some real presence there. So what we'll do is we'll use that one to throw sounds to the back of a mix. And we'll use the next one as a thickener. Let's say that we'll use it as kind of to thicken timbres, this one. So for this one, we want something that will thicken our sound. So what we'll do, we'll go for a small one. A small room, I'd say. The multi-vocals. Now that's always a good one. It's good for thickening out timbres. If we leave the pre-delay as well on 0, the sound of this is beautiful. Finally, what we'll do is we'll call up this fourth one. And what we're going to do for this one is, again, we're going to call up a small space. So let's call up a small space. We'll get a room. And I'll say we'll go for a studio stage small. And again, but what we'll do with this one, we'll increase this to about, we'll go for about 12 milliseconds there. So you can see there, what we've got basically is we've got basically 3 reverbs that are going to create some spatial awareness, and we've got 1 reverb that we can use for thickening out timbres. And what I'm going to do is on this next channel, I'm going to drop in just a, let's see, we just want basically a basic chorus. We can use this just to thicken timbres up. I'm not going to adjust any of this. We're just going to keep that as it is, and as we send sounds to it, we can adjust this and get it sounding right when we need to thicken timbres that little bit more. Now, for the final one, what we're going to do is we're going to drop on the SSL, the SSL bus compressor. So let's get that there now. Now you're probably wondering why the hell we have a compressor on a bus and not on an insert, but all that'll become clear later if you just bear with me for now. We'll just set this one up for now. We'll set the attack quite fast, leave the release on auto, 2 to 1 is fine. What we'll do is just lower the threshold for now, just to 0 dB. We're going to adjust this further when we come into the mix, and we'll leave the makeup gain as it is. And finally what we're going to do is we're going to shove another SSL compressor right on the end of the mix as well. There, stereo compressor right on the end of the mix. Now, basically what that means is we're going to mix through this compressor here. Now, let me explain why, because I'm sure there's going to be someone why mix through a compressor. Well, all mixes benefit from compression, especially the SSL bus compressor, because it just adds that special something to a mix that really does make it sound fantastic. Now, I could always mix down and compress afterwards, but if I do that, the compressor's obviously going to trigger on the loudest parts of the mix, and when the compressor activates, it is going to mess with the volume levels that I've just spent an hour or so carefully setting up. But if I mix through the compressor, I'll get that compressed sound without it messing up my levels. So what I tend to do, I put my compressor on the end and I mix through it, and that'll give me the right sound without it messing up my levels later. So what we're going to do first of all is 2 to 1 ratio is absolutely fine for this type of mix. An attack of 1 millisecond, auto release, and now what we need to do, we need to set this up so it's constantly activated while the mix is playing. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set this to the center of the mix there. And we'll start playback there. Let's turn that off, otherwise it'll fly right back to the beginning. We'll start playback here. I'm just going to lower the threshold. Just so we're knocking around 4 dB there. Now obviously, that's made a difference to the volume there, so I'm going to increase the makeup gain to get that same volume back. I'd say that's pretty much it. It sounds the same with the compressor in, and then you take the compressor out and the volume's the same. So we're not being fooled by a volume difference there. We know that anything that this is doing we can hear is not being created by a volume difference. So with that, I'd say that that's pretty much our very basic mix setup there for this. So what we're going to do is in the next session, we're going to start on the mix down.